This is a rerun of a presentation I gave on the 5th of July at a conference called Reimagining Landscapes, which Karen Lloyd organised at Lancaster University, which she kindly invited me to. The title of my talk, some of you may guess where I get some of the wording from, is The First Time as Tragedy, the Second as Farce, an alternative history of right to roam. If you don't know where that wording comes from, all will be revealed. And my name's Simon Leadbeater. I come from the St Albans area, but really the only thing you need to know about me for the purposes of this talk is that I'm what some people would describe as a landowner. However, our 57 acres is but a postage stamp for an earl, but I recognise it is a vast area of private space for many. My wife Tony and I have lived off-grid for what seems like forever. Most of our land comprises woodland, but we also have a 5-acre pasture where I run a small farm animal sanctuary. I'm not suggesting our situation is representative, but I think our experience has revealed universal learning. I'm going to start by telling you part of our story. Once upon a time, 1999 to be precise, we bought a woodland. And in those days, we used to drive there from our home and walk our dogs there every weekend. And our dogs used to have a whale of a time disappearing into the distance, chasing the deer. And we would march up and down our domain. And why shouldn't we? It was our land, our property, within reason to do with exactly as we willed. Wind forward 1.5 decades, and we found ourselves living there. Our German shepherds replaced for wolf dogs, not my idea, I hasten to add. And life had changed in many ways. It was quite difficult to begin with, but we were stranded and we could not return to our old life. And we could not simply let our wolf dogs roam as we had with our shepherds to some extent, because their prey drive was quite different. And the local wildlife, sheep, and indeed their lives would have been quite short indeed. Life was a bit miserable, and training up the wolf dogs not a lot of fun, especially for them. So one day we made this rash decision to create a large run, or a pen as we called it. And without knowing it, we found that we crossed a threshold by doing that. Suddenly we started seeing wildlife as if for the first time. We enjoyed seeing foxes lolling around at ease, and we started giving names to the deer. There was one deer I was very fond of, a chap called Cheeky. He used to remonstrate with the dogs from behind the safety of his fence. This boy on the right, Rufus, sadly no longer with us, probably because of his beautiful head. Now, for many woodland owners and managers, deer are simply pests. But one in particular became my muse. I used to love looking out for a white doe. And I noticed that she would sometimes stay resting in exactly the same space for 8 and more hours every day. Now, what I'm doing here is not so much as noticing nature, but rather noticing individual animals. What are better? Who are animals? It was Darwin who revealed that the difference between us and animals is simply one of degree and not kind. Mark Beckhoff and Jessica Pearce have suggested that those differences in degree are being blasted away all the time. And Mark, in his latest book, The Emotional Lives of Animals, has suggested animals like us share love, joy, grief, awe, and even behave what we would describe as religiously and conduct themselves morally. Now, so far as the right to roam movement is concerned, these insights have 3 vital corollaries. The first is that there is no biological basis for human exceptionalism. Secondly, we should feel empathy with creatures who can suffer as we do. Third, equivalent moral standing fits us all. We are not morally superior to other animals. And that compels us to adhere to the golden rule. Do unto others as others would do unto you. Now, it is with this zoocentric rather than anthropocentric lens that I view the Right to Roam movement. My intention is to explore a number of their premises. And first, I'm going to look at their historical inspiration. I'm going to examine the science behind human disturbance. And then I'm going to touch on rights for whom and whose land. And I'm going to conclude by saying why I think Right to Roam is both tragedy and farce. There is a galaxy of stars of people who believe in Right to Roam, but I think Guy Shrubshaw and Nick Hayes are perhaps two individuals we should talk about. Guy Shrubshaw would argue that the unequal distribution of land in England is all to do with history drenched in blood started by William the Conqueror. And Nick Hayes would tell us that our stately homes are radiant monoliths to the myth of white supremacy, monuments of deep-set national shame. Wonderful language, and I kind of wondered where this language came from. And I cast my life back to a previous life when I was a student, when I had a certain gentleman as a poster on the wall of my student digs. I was enthralled by the language of Marx and Engels. And I could recite this off by heart. The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed. Marvelous stuff. But decades later, and it has taken me decades, I finally come to realize how very conservative these words are, how time limited the frame of references, and how parochial the focus. Because what Marx and Engels do here is create an intra-species dialectic. That's to say, it's all about us. And while we excel in oppressing each other, what we all share is an unfettered oppression of other species. So I'm going to offer an alternative interpretation of history. The hitherto development of a human civilization is predicated upon the annihilation of other species and the extirpation of their wild habitats. And now a spectre of extinction haunts the world, whereby species declines and extinctions are taking place on land and in water, practically everywhere. Now, how did this all come to pass? Well, originally it came to pass because we exercised our right to roam some 100,000 or so, give or take, years ago. This is a chart pinched from Hannah Ritchie, and it expresses the out of Africa diaspora, as it's called, and shows the different directions early people wandered once they left East Africa. And what was the outcome? Hannah Ritchie's figures, my chart, essentially overkill. We annihilated what are called megafauna, large animals. And to give a flavour of that, since coming into contact with them, 85% of wild animals, or wild mammals, sorry, have been exterminated. What happened to the land? Well, before the advent of agriculture, nearly 60% of the world was cloaked with forest. We've lost a third of that forest, but what remains is not the same. Only 2% of forest in Europe, for example, now consists of what we would call wildwood, the original characteristics of the world as it once was. All that has gone from England over 70% is now agriculture, and 10% of it is woodland, but only 2.5% of that is ancient semi-natural woodland, which is not the same as wild. Now it is these vestiges, these faint echoes of erstwhile wild land, ranging from woodland to arable field margins, which right-to-roam campaigners target for public access. Now at this point, I'm pretty sure I know what everyone watching this video will say. Surely the behavior of early peoples exterminating megafauna is not the same as people going for a walk and enjoying the English countryside today. But for whom is it not the same? About 2 years or so ago, a friend of mine and I began to look at the research of the science of human disturbance across the world. And we are overwhelmingly perceived as predators by wild animals. As I was preparing this presentation, a new study popped into my inbox from the Royal Society, describing us as human super predators. In other words, our dulcet tones are scarier than a lion's roar. One obvious impact of us is fleeing behavior. And I illustrate that with something happened a couple of years ago. Some people may remember a selfish jogger who wanted to jog exactly where he wanted to go, despite the entreaties of wildlife wardens. And he caused a seal stampede, and pups may have been harmed or killed by that. The point is, you don't need to be an ethologist, as Mark Beckhoff is, someone who studies animal behavior. We can all see this. Fleeing behavior is absolutely obvious. Now, Joe and I have created what we call a policy briefing, whereby we have tried to pull all these scientific reports we can find into one single document. And I have copies of that, and which are available, and electronic copies are better because they show the hyperlinks. To coin or to quote one commentator, Professor Sarah Reed, she would say that people assume that recreation and conservation are compatible, but the fact is evidence suggests they don't. So to bring back in Mark Beckhoff and Jessica Reed, they coined this phrase, knowledge translation gap. In other words, there is what we know, and this is what the policy briefing tries to capture, and there's how we actually behave, and indeed how we want to behave as far as right to roam campaigners are concerned. Now, clearly, we need to try to bridge that gap. On a more positive note, there seems to be some momentum building for giving a right to nature. I was fortunate enough to be invited by Helen Kopnina to contribute to a chapter on this in a recent publication. And here we examined what Thomas Berry called inverse jurisprudence. And what this essentially means is you cannot give nature or nature's components, such as trees or animals, rights. All you can do is take them away. So, for example, if someone comes up with the bright idea of creating a cycleway and a footpath along a river and encouraging wild swimming and canoeing in a river, what would a family of water voles think about that? After all, it is their river. It is their river. And to me, that is a central question. The answer we came up with was that we should try to vote on their behalf in a form of eco-democracy, a term coined by her. In other words, we should act as their proxies. I'll come back to that. Now, nearing the end of my talk, I acknowledge that I am perhaps fortunate. And I do ask myself, am I connected to nature? Or perhaps it's complicated. But what I do detect, especially when I see furtive movements out of the corner of my eye, what I detect is what Thomas Berry would call a numinous presence. I love that phrase, a numinous presence. Now, do I go and explore? Well, no, I don't, because I do not wish to experience commotion, alarms barked, a sudden fleeing, a suddenly empty forest, all enchantment melting into air, or holiness profaned. Is it important for nature to recover that we are better connected? Well, perhaps, but I would say empathy is more important still, and applying the golden rule more important than that. One day, I was walking along the edge of our woodland, rather purposefully rather than observantly, and I experienced a flash of white. I glanced up, and there was my white doe, staring at me, poised for flight, about to shift any minute if there was any further encroachment, any intimation of further encroachment on my part. I froze. Involuntarily, I then found myself bowing, as I would to a queen, before slowly turning around and gradually retracing my steps. Some people would say my sentiments are completely misplaced or even absurd, ridiculous. But I am indebted to that white doe. She bequeathed to me an epiphany. The land I always thought of as mine did not belong to me at all. According to Marx, history always repeats itself twice. The first time is tragedy, the second is farce. When we exercised our right to roam, we fired the starting gun on the Sixth Great Extinction Event. This event is qualitatively different from previous events in its extraordinary rapidity and by being driven by one species, namely us. Chief characteristics. First of all, our predation of other animals, which continues unabated. Second, our roaming over the whole earth. Our physical presence is becoming increasingly ubiquitous. It takes little imagination to conjure into one single anguished utterance all the life and wonder we have quashed in preceding millennia, and more recently, centuries, decades, years, months, leading all the way to this morning. The forever silencing of divine voices, how Thomas Berry expressed the tragedy of extinction. So why do I think the modern version of Right to Roam is a farce? Well, British sitcoms have various comings and goings and carryings on, and I think that's the case here. First of all, I have been frustrated with some media reportage, including The Guardian, and I've had to challenge some headlines. So, for example, a couple of years ago, John Moses argued that there was a staggering 92% of England was off limits, and that is, of course, not true. And I've managed to change that headline. Last month, Helena Horton said there was a policy which closes 92% of English countryside. Again, that is untrue. And the headline, or the second paragraph, which says in England only 8% of countryside is where we have access, actually mixes country and countryside, and again is not true. I hoped for a more positive reportage going forward. What we cannot criticise, however, is the enthusiasm of the Right to Roam's publicity machine. It is relentless. And their latest epistle is a book called Wild Service. I'm reviewing this book, and I have thus far got to page 1. Now, there's not time to read this, obviously, during this presentation, but essentially what they're trying to contrast is a freely open church available to all, and a large country estate with the gates locked, closed to all. However, as it turns out, this country estate has 1,700 acres of open access where people can walk and picnic and so on. And the church, well, I love this phrase, the grace of God and the meanness of man. The church is actually kept open by the landowner's 91-year-old mother, who opens it in the morning and shuts it in the afternoon. Now, it would seem to me that falling down on such basic research and playing fast and furious with the truth makes having a sensible conversation, never mind dialogue, nigh impossible. To conclude, the Right to Roam campaign believes that nature's recovery requires a precondition. That's the phrase they use, precondition. And that precondition is indeed a right to roam. And yet we know that human disturbance, our roaming in nature, affects almost all aspects of animal lives, and cumulatively has cascading ecological impacts and even affects evolutionary trajectories. In other words, it affects nature. Is it not therefore a farce that the right to roam's precondition is not merely wrong in degree, it is wrong in kind? Now, I gave this talk on the day after the 2024 general election, so I'd like to end on a topical note. The Liberal Democrats promised to explore a right to roam in waterways. The Conservatives said they wouldn't introduce a right to roam. So my question is, who then would a water vole have voted for, or who should we have voted for if voting on behalf of water voles? I hope I have conveyed some of the complexity of this subject and another side of the story. I have scribbled on this subject before, and I feel quite proud of my article Covenant with the Wild, which can be found with the Ecological Citizen. My review of wild service will appear on the Ecos Wild site. It now only remains for me to thank you very much for watching this video. Thank you.